because I don't know if I have the right it's unclear whether this is working. Okay, hopefully I'm live and hopefully I have the right title now. I don't know if it's going to have the right title, so I'm just going to keep refreshing my LinkedIn to see if yes, I have the right title. Okay, good. All right, we're live. That's great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a book review. This is a quick book review, and it's going to be a book review of two books: Richard Rumelt's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. There you go. You can see that there. Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and this one here, which is called Understanding Michael Porter by Joan Magretta. Now, this one here, Michael Porter is a famous strategy professor, and he wrote a large number of great books that I have not read. But as people say about the classics are books that everyone wishes they had read, but no one wants to actually read. One could argue that that's the case, but who knows? But apparently Michael Porter is quite hard to read. I do plan on reading some more of Michael Porter in the future just because this was such a good book. But this is a really consumable, easy to read summary by Joan Magretta, who worked closely with Michael Porter. Now, by the way, if you want to, there's a comments. You should be able to leave a comment on LinkedIn, and I should see it. We'll see if it works. I should be able to see it, and I should be able to put it on screen. But this is the first time I'm doing a live quite like this, so I don't guarantee that it'll work. We'll see how it goes. Now I'm going to talk about these two books. So I'm going to be talking about them in the context of a reader. Obviously, I read them. I recommend these strongly. So this one here is called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and it really does talk about what makes good strategy. Now, actually, before I go into that, why am I talking about strategy? Why is strategy important? And in some ways, it should be obvious why strategy is important, but why is it relevant to what I do in a business? What I do in my business, I teach companies how to do OKRs and how to express OKRs for the quarter, right? Now, if you're doing that, what I have found is that most of my customers have a strategy. They have a deck that has like some pillars on it or something like that, some sort of like strategic layout, or maybe 4 quadrants, and these are the things that are part of our strategy. When we come to express OKRs, we discover that the strategy is not clear enough and they can't align on it. They're not aligned on it, and they can't decide what their strategy should be. So we then have to go through a process of understanding what strategy is. So I decided to read these books to make sure that I really understood the topic. So this book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, is the first book that I've ever read that explains what makes a strategy, what a strategy looks like. Now, I have to say, this book, it's not a massive book. I read this on Kindle, actually. I've got the paperback edition just because I like to have paperback copies of books that I find excellent. This book was excellent. It has 3 parts. The first part is on sort of like theory. It's like how he thinks about strategy. So it talks about good and bad strategy. The second part is sources of power, and that's his sort of theory of what makes strategy, like what types of decisions you have to make. And then the third part is thinking like a strategist, which I didn't think was very good. I thought the first part was excellent, and the second part was pretty interesting because it has lots of really, really good case studies and stories. Richard Rumelt is a strategy professor from some big university somewhere, one of the famous universities, Stanford or Harvard or Kellogg or one of those things. Anyway, he's a great strategy professor, so he has lots and lots of case studies. But the best part about this book is the first part, part 1, which is called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and it talks about if you look at this book, it's basically just this much of it. So just that much of the book that I strongly recommend reading. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out a couple of really interesting things from there. He has, oddly enough, in chapter 5, I think it would have been good in chapter 1, but in chapter 5 he talks about what does a good strategy look like, and it has 3 main parts, and this is something that I think is super useful and understanding. There's 3 parts to good strategy. Number 1 is a diagnosis. You need to diagnose what's the current situation, what's happening in the world, why do we need a strategy, and what are the opportunities, and what are the differences in our competitive situation in our market, what's happening, where are our threats and challenges. So you're simplifying. It might be really complicated what's really going on, but when you diagnose it and put it into a strategy slide or a strategy presentation or a paper or a communication or a presentation, you want to simplify it and we're having this problem, or the opportunity is this. Customers are not satisfied because of this, this, and this. Therefore, next step, right? And you want to have that really critically clear. Now, the reason you have that clear is because unless everyone in the company understands what the diagnosis is, they won't understand why you've got the rest of the strategy. And so having a commonality of understanding what the diagnosis is critical. This also, by the way, tells us why we need to have regular KPI meetings, regular sort of reviews of what the current business really is, and regularly looking at the market and understanding our customers. Because if we don't do that, we don't understand what the right strategy should be. The second part is the guiding policy for dealing with the challenge. So there's a challenge, right? Your customers are upset with the current options because the current options are too expensive, or our customers are upset because we're too slow at delivering. And then there's the guiding policy. And this is the guiding policy is what generally are we going to do about this? What's the overall approach chosen to affect those obstacles? Now, when we're reading this, because we can see the diagnosis and we can see the overall policy, the overall guiding policy, like we are going to simplify our offerings, or therefore we are going to remove all of the prior commitments, or get rid of the prior commitments and filter them out, get them all done, and not take on new commitments except for this particular area, right? Or therefore we are going to, if you're a Ryanair or if you're an airline, we're going to have really fast turnaround and no frills so that we can have really low costs, right? That's sort of the guiding policy that they're trying to get to. It's like the destination almost. It's like the strategic goal of where you're trying to get to, right? So, you're choosing the way of attacking or the policy for attacking. Now, the third part is the set of coherent actions. And this is different to a plan, and it's different to OKRs. The set of coherent actions is overall looking at this this strategy that you're trying to do, this set of guiding policy, like what you're going to do. It's turning it into action, but not in a really detailed sense. Just like, here are the really coherent things that we're going to do. We need to do this first. So first of all, we need to look at our existing commitments and remove the old ones, like either deliver them or cancel them, renegotiate them. Then we're going to apply those resources to delivering new features, right? Or whatever it is. Now, you have that sort of like overall structure, and you want to look at this in a strategic sense. You're looking at maybe 6 months in the future, maybe 6 months, maybe 6 years, maybe 3 years in the future, maybe 10 years, usually a few years at least in the future. You're looking down, this is the general direction we're going in. We're going to develop this kind of piece of technology, this kind of product that solves that problem. Now that's your coherent actions. And specifically, this needs to be coherent, right? As in, if you've got multiple things going on, you need to be able to say, we're going to do this, which then releases resources to allow us to focus on that, which is going to give us the advantage. Okay, so that's the kernel of good strategy, Richard Rumelt style. And I think that that's been really useful for me in understanding what a strategy is, because if someone shows me a set of pillars, or this is our strategy, and I can't tell from what they're saying where they think the opportunity is, like where the challenge or opportunity is, what the diagnosis, and I can't see what their policy is on what they're doing, and I can't see what the actions are, what their overall sort of sequence of actions and how they relate to each other in order to deliver that policy, in order to meet the challenge, then I know that the policy, the strategy is not quite right, right? It's really, really obvious when you look at it and you go, well, that's not a strategy. That's a roadmap, or that's a list of priorities, or that's a collection of all of the things you can do. Now, this book, he talks about a couple of other things that I think are really interesting. Actually, one definition that I found really interesting in here is just overall, what is the strategy for? It's a strategy is to transform vague overall goals into a coherent set of actionable objectives. Now, the connection here is that we have the overall goal is to increase profit, or to increase market share, or to increase sales, or whatever it is we're doing here. That might be quite specific. You might have increase it from X to Y. Right, that's the business goal, but that's not going to help you do anything in your business. That's what you're trying to achieve. You come up with a strategy to figure out, given the current situation, what do we do in order to achieve the things we want to achieve, right? I'm just going to move some things off screen so I don't get distracted by my own face, which is quite hard. Bear with me for a moment. I'll put that there. There we go. So basically, you get it has your own face on screen. It's so hard not to look at it. But it translates this business goal. The strategy translates the business goal into something that's coherent and objectives, and that's the OKRs. Now, what we're doing with OKRs is we have here are our quarterly things we're going to do this quarter in order to implement our strategy. The strategy has actions which go longer term. It's sort of you've got a piece of a longer term, sort of not quite a roadmap, but just like you're going to do this, then that, then the other, and these things all link together like this to deliver that. To implement that policy and to meet that challenge, right? So your strategy is the part between there that connects your overall goals and whether you can meet your overall goals to your actual objectives. And then you can execute those objectives. If you get your execution right, then you know you're executing your strategy. And if you're failing to meet your goals, it means that your strategy is not right. So it's really helpful to understand the difference between strategy and execution and how that relates to meeting goals. And one of the failures that I see lots of businesses doing is taking business goals, like we're going to meet this much revenue, and just delegating them, telling people this is the revenue target. And I have one customer who had a return on equity invested as a goal that they gave to all their management team. And everyone had a different idea of how to do this. So it didn't help them to come up with anything at all. They all disagreed on what to do. Now, one of the other things that this book is really good at is talking about bad strategy. It's good strategy and bad strategy. And it talks about, there's a couple of interesting challenges here. Fluff is one of them, like when you have a strategy that has a lot of fluff in it, a lot of highfalutin words, a lot of words that seem really sophisticated but don't actually say anything. That's usually basically like creating the illusion of a strategy. If it's something that you struggle to understand when you're reading it, it's probably not a strategy. If people talk about disintermediation and so on, what are they really meaning here? And when you get down to what they're really meaning, they mean direct relationships with customers. They failed to face the challenge. If you haven't actually defined the challenge and you can't actually meet that challenge, and you're not meeting that specific challenge, then you don't really have a strategy. There's just, we've got a series of things we're doing and a policy for doing something, but why and what are we trying to achieve by doing it? There's the two that I think are really interesting in this, the bad strategy, are mistaking goals for strategy, merely having goals or merely having an objective, or a roadmap. That's not a strategy. That's a plan. It's helpful. It's not really a plan for overcoming the obstacles, because you don't have what the obstacles are or how you're making decisions. No one can assess whether this is a good approach to that particular scenario or not. And then finally, bad strategic objectives. And I thought the bad strategic objectives were really interesting. This is almost approaching the OKR level. Like as you get down to when you create OKRs, or objectives and key results, you can often end up in a situation where, or even when people are expressing their strategy, frequently enough, it's like a dog's dinner. It's like everything. We would do all of these things. We've got to do all of the things. And yes, that's all of the things you could possibly do to compete. And if you did all of them really, really well, you'd probably win. But you can't do all of them really, really well. And while you're trying to do all of them, someone else is focusing and winning on something. So that's one of the key things. And the second one was blue sky objectives, like objectives that are way too ambitious. Like they're too far away from reality. And it's just people can't see a connection. And this is where sometimes in OKR world, we talk about stretch goals, and it's really helpful. Stretch goals are great and all that, but it's really helpful to think about objectives that are actually achievable. Like, how do I make this credible and actually achievable? So talking about a strategy that you have a plan for. Now, there's one thing I just talked about there was how to make here. So this is how to really about good strategy and bad strategy, how to tell the difference. And I talked briefly about mistaking goals for strategy and so on. And now I've lost my train of thought. I'm going to talk about this book now. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments before or after, whatever. If you're watching the replay, stick your questions in the comments. This book here, Michael Porter, Joan Magretta is the author. And James Pickering, thanks very much, James, says, simply being ambitious is not a strategy. Rumelt's best book is the best book on strategy I've read so far. I agree, it's great. Being ambitious is not a strategy. This one here is actually really interesting too. So Michael Porter is famous for the 5 forces analysis. And if you've ever seen that, it looks like this. Where is it? Nope, don't tell me I didn't put a marker in there for it. Is it there? Do I have it? Can I find it easily or not? I don't think I can. So the 5 forces analysis is basically the way you analyze an industry, and you talk about, here we are, this is it, the industry structure. So it's this, oh, you can't see that, can you? Okay, you're not going to be able to read that properly, but whatever. There's 5 forces of the industry, and basically the idea is that there's rivalry, there's new entrants, there's bargaining power of buyers, there's bargaining power of suppliers, and there's the threat of substitutes, the alternative products that could be different to what you're actually selling, not just your immediate competitors. So that's the 5 forces. He's famous for that, and that's often used in business schools. It's taught in every business school, pretty much, and it's used to understand industry structure and so on. Now, but what's really interesting here is that what he talks about is that strategy is really about taking advantage of the industry structure, like how your industry is structured around these 5 forces. What's happening here? Are there strong suppliers, strong buyers, lots of new entrants? Is it easy to enter? Is there a lot of rivalry? And how do you position yourself in relation to them in order to generate a better result? And what he says is that a strategy explains how an organization faced with competition in the context of these 5 forces will achieve superior performance. And it's not just about making a profit or about being bigger or growing faster. It's about how do you capture more profit than other companies, right? And that means you might be a smaller market. Like if you look at Apple with the iPhone, they're pretty big player in the market, but specifically they capture most of the profit in the industry, right? So I found that really interesting. That's the 5 forces tool. Now, I've lost my page. That's okay. But the other thing that happens here is that he talks about how to compete in this context, and he talks very similarly to Rumelt in many ways. They're very compatible books. I strongly recommend reading the first half of this book, and at least and this book here is really good. This is basically talks about how to compete, and what he's talking about here is that you need to do something different. So he separates out the industry from your value chain, which is how you produce value, and how your competitors or alternatives produce value, what activities they're doing. And your choice is basically between either trying to compete by being the best, like doing the same things that they're doing, but executing better, and then you might meet the same needs, but at a lower cost, or you might have slightly higher quality or whatever. That might be an advantage, but it's very hard to sustain. So this is the traditional type of competition. You're competing to be the best. You're competing on execution. The alternative, or the idea of competing on strategy, is to perform different activities to your rivals. So you want to choose a different value proposition, something different about your value proposition. And this is where the rest of this book is really excellent. He talks about the different things you need to do. So creating value, like what's your core value proposition? How is what you're offering people different to what someone else is offering? Not necessarily better. It has to be better on at least some aspects, but not all. Like if you look at EasyJet for flights, they're better because they're cheaper. They're better because they're faster. They're more frequent, right? But they're worse if you need any transfers. If you look at Apple, they're better in design. They're better in usability in many cases, but they miss out on certain things. Like gaming, for example, they're not as good at gaming. But they've got a unique value proposition. But more than that, you have to have a unique value chain, like a unique set of things that you're doing that are different, that enable you to produce that value proposition in a way that other people cannot. So Apple, for example, owns its software and its hardware, which means that Dell or Microsoft can't compete with them because they don't own both of them. Even Microsoft with Microsoft Surface, they're doing things in a market where they have dependencies for their software as well as their own hardware. And so they can't necessarily compete directly with Apple in the same ways because they have all sorts of other things that they have to do. So Apple is much better at making Apple's value proposition than Microsoft is, and Apple's better at making Apple's value proposition than Dell is. And so what this means is that you're choosing not just a different value proposition and different value chains, right? But that value chain involves trade-offs, and those trade-offs are hard to make. So you look at the different companies, like IKEA is a great example. One of their trade-offs, rather, is that you have to build your own furniture, right? Which means their prices are much lower, which means that they can deliver things much faster. You can get immediate gratification because you pick up the box and take it home. Now, nobody else can do that because they've decided that you're not going to build it yourself. You have to build it. They have to build it, which then means that they can't afford to store it and ship it. So then they have to have it in warehouses and ship it to you 4 weeks later, which means you can't get instant gratification. So that trade-off is really important. Then you need fit between all of the different things you've chosen as part of your strategy. They need to fit together and amplify each other. So they sort of but because we have flat pack furniture, we can, then people can build it themselves and they can put it in their cars and it's instant gratification. And these things all fit together, but that also fits into having a large warehouse and a showroom, and then people going and doing self-service without customer service, without salespeople. And all these things amplify each other because each one of them is a hard trade-off. But by making them all at the same time, we get a much stronger way of delivering our value proposition. And finally, this talks about continuity, which is basically doing the same strategy for a long period of time, which doesn't mean being static. It doesn't mean sort of never innovating. In fact, it means that you can innovate because you're focused on a particular value proposition, particular value chain, and doing things. So if you're thinking about strategy, these 2 books I highly recommend. I think they're great. There's a couple of others that I'm planning to read that I have read that I thought were excellent as well. But these 2 I strongly recommend. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Drop them in the notes. I've seen just one from James. Great to see you, James. Feel free to drop them further in there and I'll respond to them online. All right. Have a great day. Happy Friday. Bye-bye.